Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
SF Kosa.
Hey there, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me on.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me about your writing?
Sure. Like about this particular book or about my writing in general?
How about we do more about writing in general and then kind of like go into more about this specific book we're talking about?
Gosh. I have written in many, many different genres. I have about a dozen young adult novels, and I have 3 adult trilogies, but all of those are in the sci-fi, fantasy, and urban fantasy genres. And a few years ago, I decided to switch into a completely different genre and start writing psychological thrillers. And so I have 2 of those. And that's what my current book that just came out, The Night We Burned, is my second psychological thriller.
And The Night We Burned is, I know I just said this to you a second ago, but it is so amazing. And for anyone listening to this, please go read this book. It is so disturbing and so great. Excellent, exceptional thriller. So can you tell me a little bit more about The Night We Burned and like the storyline for it and how you got inspired to write this? Because it's got a very interesting premise.
Sure. So The Night We Burned is about Dora, who is a fact checker and copy editor for an online news magazine. And so she's very devoted to accuracy in reporting, the accuracy of facts down to, the spelling of a name, a date, etc. That's her whole livelihood, and she believes in it strongly until a colleague of hers, a journalist, decides to report on the story of a bizarre murder that took place in Dora's hometown and is linked to a cult massacre that took place 20 years earlier. And when Dora realizes this, she realizes she has to set out on a journey to conceal and change the facts to hide her connection to this terrible event that took place. And so that's what the book is about. Of course, Dora doesn't realize until it's a little too late that she has a lot more to fear from the present than the past.
And can you tell me a little bit about how you decided, what the things that you decided to do with the timeline in this book? Because it's very interesting because it alternates between the past and present, kind of telling the story of her connection to these murders and this cult, and then like going into how she's running away from that connection.
Sure. So when I first decided to write this book, the first kernel of the idea started in the present with a fact checker who had decided to change the facts. Like I was just like, well, what if I wrote a book about a fact checker who decides to change the facts? And I just thought that was sort of an interesting idea. And I started to think, as soon as I had that thought, well, why would anybody want to do that? And I hit upon this idea that there's something in her past that comes back to haunt her. And it is, her determination to try to rewrite history is connected to something she's very ashamed of and fearful of in her past. And so I have written other books that use this format, and I like the present past, the challenge of it in a narrative. And I thought it really fit this particular book and this concept because there's, a reporter who is trying to report on something that is linked to the past. And so you're learning about what happened in the past in the year leading up to this catastrophe, this fire that killed a few dozen people, members of this cult. So you're learning about that in the past narrative, and in the present, you're seeing Dora's frantic attempts to conceal any traces of her involvement or connection to that, past timeline. And you sort of see how she does it. and why she might want to do it. But there's like a mystery evolving about like, well, what exactly did she do? And what, was her connection to it? And so you learn about it in that past narrative. And I just love the way I like reading books that have this same sort of structure, because you just see the way the two storylines dovetail and connect, and, at what points they connect. And I find it a really interesting way to tell a story.
I really love reading this way too. And one of my favorite parts in like that entire like formatting of it is the fact that in more of Dora's storyline in the present, she reveals things that happen in the past. So it's like you're kind of anticipating certain bits. Like you're like, all right, I know this one character is about to do something horrible. I don't know what it is, and I don't know when it happens, but it really keeps you on the edge of your seat, because you're like, what would compel them to do something like that? And then you get to see it.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun it's a pretty fun way to tell a story. Like I said, I just love that, like, you can have a casual mention, but then you can actually show the event unfolding, or you can have a reference that's a bit of a mystery, and then you might see it. You can also meet a character in the present and you see them in the past as well. And, why her current feelings about them are what they are. And so I definitely think there are lots of opportunities with that kind of structure that are pretty fun. And I definitely wanted to take my time with the narrative of what happened in the past to sort of show, I think cults are hard to understand from a psychological perspective for a lot of people. And so I really wanted to show, like, well, why would somebody get involved in that kind of group? And when things start to go sideways, why would they stay?
Yeah.
And I think that I wanted to sort of show that gradual unraveling. And it's hard to just describe. If it were all present day, it would be hard to describe all of that stuff happening and have the full emotional impact of it.
And having it go into the past, I'm going to be speaking in very vague terms here, but where I am in the book, and especially earlier on, there were certain things that she would do, and it would be like to gain approval from and then when she would get that approval, I would be like, yes. And then I'd go, oh my God, no. That's part of why it was like so like such an intense read for me, because I would be like, oh, that's awesome. Woo, she like got what she wanted. And it's like, oh no.
Yeah, like a triumph and acceptance, like, a hurdle to be passed in terms of, what she wants, which is to be part of this chosen family and this group. And it's a group of nice people and a leader she connects with. And I think that it was definitely something I wanted to show, because ultimately that is, sort of the power behind these groups, is that they're comprised of people who other people want to connect with, and that it just, it's very alluring.
One of the most chilling lines for me is at one point someone asks if they're a cult, and they reply with, no, we're just a group of like-minded people.
Right.
And I was like,
label us if you want.
No, because like it was so chilling just seeing like how they interact with the outside world and like the way that thought process goes.
Yeah, I did a lot of research about specific cults and about cult psychology to, sort of try to get that flavor as I invented a group of my own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what kind of research did you do into that?
Yeah. So I read a couple of, I did two things. One, it was just my own personal interest. So I watched a lot of documentaries like Wild Wild Country, The Vow. I think there was one on Waco. So I watched a lot, sort of consumed a lot of documentaries where people who had been part of these groups were being interviewed and talking firsthand about their experience. And anybody who's interested, I mean, Wild Wild Country is a really great one, simply because you can see smart, accomplished people talking about what drew them into these groups and why they still, the membership in the group and the vision of the leader still affects them deeply emotionally to this day. And there aren't people you can just write off, which is what I think is so powerful about their willingness to be interviewed. So I consumed a lot of media. I also read books. Like I read a biography of Jim Jones, who was the notorious leader of the People's Temple that resulted in the Jonestown massacre, where 900 people died, mostly by suicide. That's where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid comes from, is that particular cult massacre. So I read his biography. I read a biography of Charles Manson, looking at the ways they deliberately manipulated people, targeted their vulnerabilities, particularly their female followers, in a way that sort of drew them in and kept them close. And completely under their power. So I did a lot of, sort of just reading about how these things went down historically and who these cult leaders were. But I also did some reading about cult psychology. So there's a book called, I think it's Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexander Stein. It's about attachment in totalitarian groups and systems. And then I also was heavily influenced by Steve Hassan's, it's called the BITE model, BITE, the BITE model of authoritarian control. So BITE stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion. And on his website, you see that he's listed like all of these different ways that these groups tend to control behavior, routines, especially routines, chores, rituals, etc. Information, like limiting information from the outside, supplying an alternative narrative. So control of information and supplying a false information. Thought, like having people engage in sort of customs that tend to cut off questioning and doubts. Just sort of thought stopping, chanting and meditation, things like that. And then emotion. So feelings, enhancing feelings of guilt and responsibility, fear, extremes of emotion. So I did a lot of reading about like the actual sort of abstracted kinds of things that high control groups, otherwise known as cults, engage in to control their followers. And then I incorporated a very large amount of that into the cult that I invented in the book. The cult is called the Oracles of Innocence, and its leader does, things like giving people new names. So they sort of shed their old identity, just looking to control access to the outside world, really working people very hard so that they're too tired to question things too much. There are all sorts of things that a lot of these groups actually have in common. And that's because they're highly effective in getting people to sort of cling to this group, not let go, even when things get really weird or really bad. And I think it certainly helped me understand those kinds of things. And I certainly hope that as people read the book, it helps other people sort of see why it might be kind of hard to just walk away from that kind of thing.
It did. It did, because I don't personally know a lot about cults. I've read a little bit. I watched Wild Wild Country. Amazing. Like really excellent documentary, terrifying. But I know a little bit about that kind of stuff, but I didn't know much. And going into this, I kind of went in with an open mind. And as I was reading it the entire time, I just felt like so much empathy for the characters in this book and for any survivors of cults, anyone that had to go through that. Cause it's like, it's so horrifying. Yeah. And it's like, they can't just leave because it's this, there's so many layers, and it's like, or like even seeing something really interesting that you did is the way that the leader treats the different people. Everyone is treated differently.
Based on,
yeah. And so it's like some people, it's like, oh no, he very definitely like psychoanalyze them in some way and knew,
Mhm.
oh, well, this one will respond to me treating them negatively and then like gushing over them. And this
Right.
one likes it better if I am like sucking up to them from the beginning and then like I lash out once. And that like there were so many moving pieces to it. It was oh
Oh, yay,
brilliant.
thanks. Well, I'm glad it worked for you. I definitely, I was very influenced by, the things I read. It was definitely very helpful. Like I said, because these techniques are so powerful that some of them I was just like, I'll just use this, I'll borrow this kind of technique for my book because it works. And it's definitely lots of source material, fortunately or unfortunately. But I also borrowed the sense of sort of shame and, stigma that exists, sort of in the world when you're outside and you've never experienced, had a, experience with a cult. I think a lot of people, it's very easy to look at former members of these groups as gullible or kind of not very bright or weak. And that's just not true. The fact is that this sort of situational and emotional control is extremely powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So, what sort of things did you do while writing this to like, I don't know exactly how to word this, but like it's such a heavy topic. And what kind of things did you do to like kind of take it out of your head when you weren't writing about it? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always written about stuff that's sort of dark. I think that sometimes my writing, I think perhaps this is true of a lot of writers, it's been a place to sort of subconsciously sort of process, some of my own feelings or, a place like an outlet for those feelings. A lot of my writing is, about, issues of, characters who have mental illness or who have experienced trauma or who are, in these experience these very extreme circumstances. So, it's just a place for me to sort of put some of that and I think process it by writing a story that is a way of sort of understanding it and making it more coherent. Because the story has to be good. It has to be, the narrative has to be coherent. There's an arc to it. And then, it's pretty easy for me to just put that aside. I have a whole bunch of kids and I have, other responsibilities and things I like to do. And so, but, it is funny that you asked me that because I have had days for sure when I was definitely in a mood and my husband might say, like, are you okay? You seem like a little bit off today. And I realize it's because in part, I've just written like this really intense scene where one of my characters is suffering in this terrible way. And I've been dealing with that all day, or my characters are fighting and there's a lot of, like sort of noise in my head from all that fighting. And it definitely, so I said, oh, it's easy for me to just put that away. But I actually think some of it, like that residue kind of sticks with you a little bit and it takes some time to kind of shed it and, watch, something funny and light or go for a walk with a friend and just talk about anything but the book you're writing.
Well, the same thing happens to me. That's why I asked that. And it used to happen to me so much. Like it would be like I was watching a show and I would be like freaking out because like the characters on the show were going through something. And then I would have like an emotional reaction to that.
Sure, of course.
Like affecting them outside of watching the show. So like I was wondering if you had any tips for that for writers, because I know it's something that a lot of us deal with, and especially in genres like this.
Yeah. Well, obviously I, I struggle with it myself. And I would say, I do think that being aware, first of all, I think insight and awareness drives any sort of intervention that you would do. So the first thing is being mindful and sort of noticing. So when you're feeling something, asking, why do I think I'm feeling this? Because that's when it's helpful to, like I said, when my husband asked me, like, are you okay? And I think about it, then I can attach it to a cause. And so I think making that connection is first and foremost the important thing. And then you can sort of think about, well, okay, why is this still lingering with me? And if you can get to that and think, well, okay, it's understandable. You can forgive yourself. It's not like you're doing anything wrong. So be kind to yourself and then find some things that actually help you get on a different track. And sometimes that is things like physical activity, or just, having a conversation about something else, getting yourself on a different track. But I wouldn't ignore it or try to put it aside. I think being mindful of, okay, I've done something difficult, emotionally difficult today. I wrote, a scene of incredible suffering, or there was incredible fear happening. And yeah, I feel that. I'm an empathic person. I feel that along with my characters. It's not quite put away inside me yet. And so, I need to do things to care for myself, both my body and my mind, to be able to increase my capacity, my, coping capacity, so I can cope with, this well and continue to do it at a high level, while containing those feelings, which, it's natural to have those things affect you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. No, that was great. And I kind of like switching what we're saying a little bit. How has your training in psychology helped your writing at all?
Yeah, I just kind of pulled it out there for you. Became my psychologist self. I've thought about this a lot because this is a question that, I've been asked since my first book came out, because my first book, dealt with the issue of suicide. So I was asked, what about being a psychologist has influenced or helped you? I think my training definitely, I'm sort of naturally interested in psychological issues or mental illness. I am a clinical psychologist. So I work with people who are really experiencing, mental health difficulties. I think, so I have a natural, sort of vocabulary and knowledge of mental illness, of treatments, of why these things happen, of what they look like, all of that. I think a lot of writers in this genre are naturally very attuned to others and they capture dynamics really well. So I wouldn't say that, my training gives me any sort of edge in that way. But in the areas in which I've decided to write, about issues of mental illness or trauma, in this case, trauma and coercive, involvement in a coercive group that really leaves a mark. I think I kind of know what kind of research I need to do. I take it pretty seriously in terms of the depth of the research and wanting to capture that accuracy because I feel like that's more respectful. Mm-hmm. So those are the ways I think it influences me. I if I'm going to cover anything involving a therapist, or somebody seeking treatment, I'm going to want to make sure that that's accurate, because that's just, sort of a professional commitment and value that I have that, if you're not in the field, you don't necessarily have. But I'll never write a book with an evil therapist.
Thank you. Because
where the therapist is the villain. I'm just not going to do that.
It's always like, what, have you been to therapy? Have you met a therapist? Every time in books like that. And it's like,
yeah, I do feel a professional responsibility to portray my field in a way that does not discourage people who need help from getting it. I want, I really believe, obviously, that, when it's necessary, psychological services are good and a valuable thing that I think people should have access to. And be able to get. And there's, some stigma, and there's, not a lot of knowledge around the process of therapy, for example. And so I feel a responsibility to, if I am going to depict it in one of my books, to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with anybody's desire or willingness to get help.
So important too, because there's so much media out there that's like, oh, look at the evil therapist, or even if it's not, even a show. Like I'm gonna out this show that I love, Never Have I Ever. She has a therapist on there, and the way that the therapy is portrayed is so wrong. Yeah. Like she just walks into her office. Okay, well, on the show, just so that way you know a little bit about it. She just walks into the therapist's office, like at all hours of the day and night. The therapist is always there and just doesn't have a client.
Oh, that sounds exhausting.
Oh, yeah, no. It gets better because every time the therapist is just like, the answer is within you, and then gives her an entire explanation for what she has to do with her life. Like, that's not...
And what's really funny is, like, I don't always mind books that with the evil therapist trope, for example. I just read, a massive bestseller with that exact trope. I will not say which one because it's a spoiler. But and I thought, I can't, like, I could not write a book with this depiction, but I appreciated the structure of the book and certainly the craftsmanship of the book. It was extraordinarily well-written book. So, like, I can certainly appreciate it. I'm not on any kind of crusade. I just, for me and the responsibility I feel to my profession, I'm going to be accurate and be respectful because I think therapy is a good thing.
Me too. So thank you for doing that. It's always good to have like authors and people in these entertainment industries working to destigmatize stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty important. The stigma is hard.
Yeah. And in your book, The Night We Burned, too, another thing that I loved about it was how you depicted how she dealt with the trauma. Because I feel like that's something that a lot of things get wrong, is characters dealing with their own traumas and stuff. And I really felt like you showed it in an interesting way that felt more realistic, and you did it with like a gentle hand,
Well, so I think that, trauma it's such there are some commonalities in the way we process traumatic experiences, because our brains are sort of wired to respond to really alarming or life-threatening events in a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. So there's like a little smoke alarm in our brain, danger, and then it can get rewired if we have a traumatic experience to make us believe we're in danger in situations that might not actually be like physically dangerous. Mm-hmm. So that's a thing that can happen, but our individual behaviors in response to trauma can vary widely, right? Because people are different. They have different experiences, different cultural backgrounds, all things that influence our, like the way it looks on the outside. Mm-hmm. But the thing that is important to me to portray is that these things, they don't just slough off easily in a lot of cases. Sometimes there's sort of a natural, repair and progression. But when they're not dealt with, when an experience is not dealt with and it's been avoided for so long, it's really hard to, just sort of escape the sort of scars it leaves. And what I wanted to show for Dora, she's been through this multiple traumatic experiences, and they're affecting her in ways that she doesn't even realize necessarily. So just her relationship with her own body has been changed.
Yeah.
In this, in the 2 decades since this catastrophe, she, it's taken a toll on her body in a very specific way. And I think, and that's certainly not the only way that long-term trauma can affect people. But it
does. It does in that way too, a lot. Right. Like,
well, yeah, our stories, write themselves on our bodies. And
I've got like 12 books over here that say that.
Yes.
Like right over. Yeah.
Sounds like you have quite a library.
Yeah. But yeah, I just thought that was something that was really interesting. And I just wanted to like thank you for being an author that does that.
Oh,
Because I feel like I've had a lot on this show that do that. But not a lot of the books that I've read have really like gone into that sort of thing. And I felt like it was very important.
yeah. I also, it's important to me not to romanticize these things, to make it just seem like, for example, like, you know, you meet the romantic love of your life and that completely fixes everything or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
you have to deal with it. I have some self-published romances that are all about this idea of people who have, mental illnesses of various types or traumatic experiences, but they're romances. But the people in these romances get to experience this romance, but they still have to deal with these issues that they brought to it. And, that the relationship brings hope and motivation, but it doesn't fix everything.
Yeah. I love that. And it's something that it's such an unhealthy, like cliche in a lot of stuff. I hate the word cliche because it's overused all the time, but that is one that it's like, no, that's not how life works. Right. You don't have one friend or one anything or one relationship that just fixes it.
That's true.
And even like in the book, how she has people that she's closer with, like Haley and like all these people. And it's like
her chosen family, additional family. Yeah. The family that chose her.
Yeah. And I just loved how you showed that, because it's like, I finally found a book that doesn't like have this sort of unhealthy narrative around this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I've certainly read, some books that embrace that complexity. And they're always very satisfying for that reason, because human relationships are definitely complicated and not easy. So it's certainly rewarding, very rewarding when you have a book that does that well. I've read something like I just read Bathhouse by PJ Vernon, which is just a fascinating thriller. But I really thought the way that he captured this relationship between these two men was particularly it had so many aspects of it that I really appreciated. And that's just one example of a book I've read recently that was very good in terms of managing to depict a dynamic in a way that is really relatable and understandable, but also shows its complexity.
I love that. Yeah. All right. Well, I only have a couple more questions for you today.
Right.
And the one right before we go out into the outro, I just have to say, how did you decide on your pseudonym?
Oh, my pseudonym. I decided I needed a pseudonym because I was changing genres in a pretty big way. Like I was going from all speculative fiction, the magic and underworlds and, all sorts of special powers. I was going from that to writing in the real world. So I decided I needed a pseudonym, but I also got married and changed my name. So I went from being Sarah Fine to Sarah Kosa. And so I became SF Kosa. So if I go back to writing fantasy, I will definitely probably use Sarah Fine again, because I have all those books published in those genres. But for my thrillers, I will continue to use SF Kosa.
I love that. It adds a layer of mystery to it almost. Like, oh, I know who Sarah Fine is, but who's this mysterious thriller author?
Kosa.
Yes. All right. Well, this is just the final question now, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I am currently writing a book about a con artist who becomes an art dealer on Martha's Vineyard.
Cool.
And her relationship with her daughter. So
that sounds awesome. Well, feel free to come back on the show, and I would love to talk about that one. Thank you so much for coming on today. This was great.
Absolutely. This was really fun.
All right, for Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
This is SNO, so goodbye.
All right, let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
End.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.